Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you've all had a chance to, as I say, grab a coffee and prepare yourself, because our next speaker really doesn't need much of an introduction to this room. Nonetheless, we are very pleased to welcome Shoshana Zuboff, who is Professor Emeritus at Harvard Business School, but more importantly, the author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and someone who's given us the language we need to be able to talk about these important matters. Shoshana, I can see you there, you're ready, you're online, so over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you who have organized this amazing day that you've enjoyed, and this wonderful invitation. And, you know, I want to offer my thanks more generally to all of those who have stood up for the European consumer movement. We are all consumer citizens now, fighting for a democratic and digital future. And I was moved by the way in which some recent research from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties demonstrates the current state of play in this fight. It describes how the surveillance giants continuously amass once private personal data and locations. They are broadcast to markets for real-time bidding, known as RTB, where advertisers bid on the opportunity to place their ad on your screen. The IAB is the nonprofit research consortium that supports real-time bidding in the ad tech industry, and it lists nearly 400 categories of targeting data used to deepen profiles, including everything from incontinence to panic anxiety disorders, literally everything you can imagine. I wish I had time to read you some choice entries on the list. Here's the point. The research findings suggest that regulatory regimes can moderate, but do not come close to abolishing these operations. For example, the average person in America has their online activity and location data exposed through RTB channels 747 times each day. In Europe, where you have privacy laws, it's better. It's about half that amount, at 376 times a day. Now, is there anyone sitting in the room right now who believes that 376 times a day is an acceptable number? And then ask yourself the question, is any number acceptable? Of course, anyone can participate in these markets and acquire these extremely intimate, detailed data. And this includes political campaigns and other avatars constructed to advance private or state interests. We're talking about Russian and Chinese cyber troops, oligarchs, illiberal politicians, repressive governments. The data flow with no means to know or control their direction, their paths, their destructive paths. And this has been true now for 2 decades. The horse fled the barn. Why did we let it keep running wild? Why did we let it loose on this destructive path since the beginning of the century? Well, let's talk a little bit about what is this horse, first of all. It's not technology, it's not the internet, it's not even more generally the digital. It's the economic logic that has hijacked all of these. In other words, it's surveillance capitalism. This statement that I've just made is the best news that I can give you. This is great news. Why? Because none of us will stop the internet or its successors in interest. None of us will stop digital technologies. No one can. But we can stop surveillance capitalism, and it's not that difficult once we understand what it is, how it works, and the genuine intervention points against which we can push. So this afternoon is not a story about tech. It's a story about power. Surveillance capitalism was born at Google in the teeth of financial emergency triggered by the dot-com crash. Google's leaders discovered early on that every human internet touchpoint leaves data traces that can be secretly mined for rich behavioral signals. These behavioral data are then instantly claimed as corporate property and computed into behavioral predictions. Surveillance capitalism has become the dominant economic paradigm in only 2 decades, based on an extraordinary, brazen, audacious idea. And sometimes I think that the reason it's been so hard for us to grasp and fight this thing is that it's really hard to believe that anyone is actually doing what I'm about to say. The idea was and is that predictions of human behavior can be sold like tons of wheat or barrels of oil. In other words, behavioral futures can be traded like any other bulk commodity. Behavioral signals are collected, computed, and processed to optimize scale, scope, volume, variety. These processes are blind to other traditional metrics of information, such as truth, facts, fidelity, integrity. This means that social information is severed from its meaning. Economic imperatives dictate systems that cannot and must not distinguish between information integrity and corruption, because that would impede the speed and scale of signals extraction and processing. In this economic regime, information integrity has no bearing on revenue. I really want you to understand that. In fact, on the contrary, corrupt information, as we have all seen, has proven to be very lucrative. The breakthrough idea here is that human behavior can be commodified. The commodification of human behavior is the foundational assumption, the foundational mission, purpose, and it leads to the foundational capabilities of surveillance capitalism. Massive scale behavioral prediction requires the secret, massive scale extraction of human generated data. This means all of us, all the time, everywhere. Hence those numbers from the Irish research that I've cited to you. Human data are the stolen treasure, and surveillance is the getaway car. Surveillance capitalism was founded on this illicit, illegitimate, but not illegal bed of sand. How could this be? Because from the dawn of the World Wide Web in the mid-1990s, democratic societies, beginning with the US, failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic values, principles, and governance. This failure left a void where democracy should be, and that void was quickly filled and tenaciously defended by surveillance capitalism. In the absence of countervailing law, my friends, a handful of companies evolved from tiny startups into trillion-dollar vertically integrated global surveillance empires. These include Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, their collaborators, satellites, and ecosystems. These now constitute a sweeping political, economic, institutional order that migrates across sectors and economies, and upon which both democratic and illiberal governments alike depend for human data, computation, prediction, and social control. In other words, surveillance capitalism is what happened when democracy stood down. The void was a political failure that forfeited the critical first decades of the digital century to surveillance capitalism. It deprived an increasingly connected global community of a clear path to a democratic and digital future. It abandoned individuals and societies to new forms of digitally mediated violence from corporations and from governments. When corporate wealth depends upon secretly extracting signals of human behavior for prediction and profit, the classic economic equation is scrambled. The concentration of economic power here is obvious. But now the crime scene expands to include unprecedented concentrations of governance power and social power. The arc of surveillance capitalism's institutional development over these last 2 decades is marked by key developmental milestones. I'm just going to mention them to you very, very quickly. First of all, the pervasive extraction of human data meant that privacy must fall, and fall it did. I know that many in the room today are champions of privacy, seek greater privacy protection, legislation, rights. But my friends, there is a harsh truth, and I don't think we have really grappled with it. Privacy, even as it existed in the year 2000, simply no longer exists. We have lived through the wholesale destruction of privacy. The word privacy itself, the concept, is a zombie category that democracy, above all, has surrendered to the walking dead. We continue to fight for it, but we can't fight for it effectively unless we recognize this harsh truth. And this truth leads to a second important milestone, and that is that the systems that surround us now, the systems are designed to maximize scale and speed of signals processing. And therefore, concerns about information integrity would necessarily introduce costly friction into these engineered systems. And that's why information integrity is ignored. These systems have no basis for judging the difference between integrity and truth. Yet tragically, and this is what also takes a moment to actually integrate into your thinking. Tragically, these systems I've described, indifferent to information integrity by design, these are now the very systems that globally intermediate our digital information and communication spaces. On the strength of their domination of human data supplies, the surveillance capitalist giants, and here's a third milestone, now control the global market of knowledge production. That's a market that we call artificial intelligence. And the fourth milestone, all of these produce a new axis of social inequality measured by the difference between what I can know and what can be known about me. With all of this knowledge is ready to transform into power. And that is expressed with the massive scale human data that we've now aggregated in these spaces, both individual and collective behavioral data, now used for psychological micro-targeting to manipulate and modify attitudes and actions in order that they align with commercial and or political objectives. And finally, in a sixth milestone, we see the giants increasingly inclined to flex their new power by going head to head with democratic governments over who will rule society. We saw it in Australia in early 2021, and most plaintively now in the EU in April 2020 with the outbreak of pandemic, as Apple and Google muscled out European governments over control of COVID contact tracing and notification, control that should have been prioritized for public health authorities in democratic societies. In other words, what I have just explained to you is that in every case, the upstream economic operations of secret, massive scale human data extraction are the origin and cause of every downstream problem that we chase, from privacy to self-determination to disinformation to the assault on democracy. None of these will be solved unless and until we face their actual cause. And of these 6 milestones and the conditions they represent that I have described to you, I can say categorically that no democracy can survive these conditions. 2 decades into this experiment in private ownership, the surveillance capitalists have failed any reasonable test of responsible global stewardship of our digital information and communication spaces. The abdication of these spaces to surveillance capitalism began as a story of American democracy, but has become the meta-crisis of every society because it obstructs solutions to all other crises. Right now, democratic societies and every struggling to be a democratic society stumbles toward a future that its citizens did not and would not choose. This future is an accidental dystopia, owned and operated by private surveillance capital, yes, but all too frequently underwritten by democratic acquiescence, collusion, and dependency. The sober truth is that the piecemeal regulation of commercial processes that are genuinely catastrophic for democracy will never produce the change we need. Catastrophe cannot be regulated. It can only be abolished. And abolition is what clears the way for the reinvention that we desperately need. And if you doubt me, consider the cases of slavery or child labor. We do not regulate these atrocities, we abolish them. Therefore, without new public institutions, charters of rights, and legal frameworks purpose-built for the democratic and digital century, we march naked, all of us, easy prey for all who steal and hunt with human data, whether these threats originate in private companies or in governments. Now, the paradox that you must solve. Democracy may be under siege, but it's the kind of siege that only democracy can end, because only democracy has a competing institutional order capable of posing an existential threat to surveillance capitalism. These two powers are locked in a death match, a zero-sum contest in which the deepening order of surveillance capitalism propagates democratic disorder. Only one of these contesting orders will emerge with the authority and power to rule, while the other will drift into obsolescence, its functions absorbed by the victor. It's true that surveillance capitalism is the new, young challenger with a lot of magic in its pockets. Democracy is the old, slow, and messy incumbent, but it has strengths that are impossible to match. First of all, it inspires action. Just ask the people of Ukraine if you doubt me. And only democracy retains the authority and power to make, impose, and enforce laws that advance the cause of democratic values and governance. It now falls to the democratic order to reclaim the void for the sake of every people, because we all desperately yearn to outrun dystopia. While the situation is challenging, evidence suggests that decisive action is within our reach. I'm struck every day by growing signs of a democratic resurgence, because each day there are new discussions and concrete institutional developments that were literally unimaginable even 3 years ago, and certainly during the many years that I dedicated myself to this work. And of course, as you know, the EU leads, although I recognize that when you're in Brussels, it doesn't always feel that way. But in 2020, the European Parliament's historic passage of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, these have fundamentally shifted the course of our big ship of the democratic order away from the iceberg of dystopia with game-changing legislative developments. The new acts break the sound barrier of surveillance capitalism's aura of inevitability and begin the work of gathering the digital into democracy's house with new oversight and audit authority, as well as critical measures that begin at least to constrain human data extraction, setting the stage for the necessary confrontation with the fundamental illegitimacy of the operations I have described to you. During the last 2 years, we've also seen civil society organizations in the EU and in the US petitioning governments to abolish surveillance advertising that sits at the heart of the surveillance capitalist project. And we see global operations of human data extraction are now in play among a vanguard of lawmakers and policymakers, both in the EU, the US, and in the UK, folks who have rallied and are rallying to the prospect of actual abolition. And simultaneously, of course, the conversation, the public conversation, moves further ahead. I don't know if how many of you know this, but just recently, just 3 weeks ago, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, led by this year's recipients, journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, published a 10-point plan to address our information crisis, beginning with the demand to, quote, bring an end to the surveillance for profit business model. And even in a long reluctant United States, oh my goodness, sorry. Even in a long reluctant United States, we see that the Federal Trade Commission has now solicited public comment on rulemaking related to, quote, commercial surveillance and data security. This too is a watershed. Okay, we complete these thoughts with just one final message. Without significant action in the next few years, I believe that the way back will be immeasurably more difficult and fraught with violence. In this third decade, we are forced to decide, will we be a democracy or will we be a surveillance society? We cannot be both. Thank you so much for your attention and time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Shoshana. I think you can probably still hear me. We are greatly appreciative of you here in Brussels. We may have time for one question. Does anyone want to ask a question? I think you're free to go. Thank you once again. Another big round of applause, not just for your speech today, but for also all your ongoing hard work.